This is Breakpoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Ideas have consequences, bad ideas have victims. Welcome to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here. Good to be back with you, Warren. I appreciated those really kind words that Shane, as he filled in for me last week, said something about filling my shoes or whatever, but I couldn't tell if he was being serious or sarcastic. So.
Oh, no. Deadly serious. If deadly serious as a compliment is even the right language to use. But yeah, no, we missed you. Glad to have you back, but I thought Shane did a nice job last week.
No, I think he was just trying to kiss up and finagle some more airtime, so maybe we'll have to have him back on here or there. We got a lot to talk about this week here as we deal with the issues of the culture from a Christian worldview. It's been a while since we really spent time on Supreme Court decisions. You know, obviously, over the last couple of years, what's happened at the Supreme Court, both in terms of religious freedom cases like Jack Phillips and new Supreme Court justices, that certainly has been one of the stories, and it leads to the story, two stories, I guess, that we're going to talk about today, two cases that were decided this week. And, you know, one of the questions is what's the new makeup of the court mean for people of faith? I know we're also asking what's the new makeup of the court mean for Roe v. Wade. That's still to be seen, but we got a little bit of an indication on what the new makeup of the court could mean for religious liberty.
Well, yeah, you're right, John. You know, we were talking about Supreme Court cases a lot a year or more ago, but these two this week suddenly came down. Sweet Cakes by Melissa, which is a case that, John, you and I have been following for a couple of years, but it kind of went dormant for a while. That one was decided by the Supreme Court. It was actually a decision to vacate an earlier decision and to send that case back to, I believe it was the Oregon Supreme Court. And then the other case was the Bladensburg Cross case. Our friend Kelly Shackelford at First Liberty Institute and his colleagues argued that case all the way to the Supreme Court, the case of a large cross that atheist groups or other related groups wanted to see taken down, but the cross can stay.
I think so. Let's dive a little bit deeper, though, on the Sweet Cakes decision. Not only because apparently it's a crazy time to be a Christian baker. I mean, it's like you didn't think the front lines of the culture wars would be pastries, but or cakes. But that's kind of what's happened. You know, very similar case to Jack Phillips, with the exception that the Oregon court imposed a really heavy fine, and that fine now has been vacated. And, of course, because of the decision in the Jack Phillips case, and we saw this earlier, by the way, with Baronelle Stutzman, in her case also being the Washington decision being vacated there and sent back to the state in light of the findings in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case. And basically what the court is saying is, look, before we look at this any closer, if you treated either of these individuals with animus and you treated their faith with hostility, then you need to change it in light of what we said in terms of the Colorado Civil Rights Commission and Jack Phillips. Now, of course, the state of Washington quickly decided that they were just great and did nothing wrong against Baronelle. And policing yourself is not always the best strategy. It's going to be interesting to see what Oregon does, because there is some of that same sort of language of animus against religious conviction of the Kleins in the Sweet Cakes backdrop. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens coming out of that case. The interesting thing to me about the Bladensburg Cross case, Warren, is that almost every conflict with religious freedom that we have seen in recent memory has had something to do with sexual liberties and sexual freedom. The exception has to do with public symbols and Christian symbols on public land.
What was interesting about it from my point of view, first of all, I agree with you. This is a case that doesn't involve sexuality that has gone all the way to the Supreme Court, so that makes it unusual. I think another thing, John, from my point of view that makes it unusual is that Samuel Alito, a conservative, wrote the majority opinion, and he was joined by a couple of justices that, normally maybe wouldn't join with the conservatives. In fact, it was only Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Sonia Sotomayor who dissented. But there was also some talk from Clarence Thomas that this decision didn't go far enough, that Alito's opinion, which basically said, no, the cross also has secular meaning, therefore it is not a religious symbol, was basically the logic of Samuel Alito's opinion, and I think that was why two normally liberal judges were willing and able to join him. But Clarence Thomas said, basically you can't take religion out of the cross, and that he wished that Samuel Alito had been stronger, in fact, to say that even if it was religious, the Constitution guarantees the right to practice religion. And unless the government is truly establishing a religion, then there was no reason to take that cross down. And this was clearly not an establishment of religion. So it's interesting that even though the case was 7-2 in favor of keeping the cross up, that Clarence Thomas wished it had gone farther.
Moving on to another story, too. But this is, to me, a really interesting juxtaposition because across the world, on the other side of the world, I mean, we've all been watching these enormous protests in the city of Hong Kong. And it's a incredible story of the conflict of worldview. We talked about it on Breakpoint last week, and we want to link to that. Come to breakpoint.org and click on the link there on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast. And the reason we want to link to that is because what we're hearing is that this whole thing is about a particular extradition law where the mainland China wants to be able to pull people out of Hong Kong and try them in China instead of allowing them to kind of operate independently, at least in that way. But it's about more than that, because it certainly is about the fact that some of the leaders that are championing the independence of Hong Kong are strong believers, and it has a lot to do with ultimate allegiance. And of course, China doesn't like the fact that Hong Kong, historically, it's been this kind of two independent ways of governing, all under the name of China and the freedom of commerce and the other freedom that they have. Even though the Communist Party now has backed off of this extradition law, at least saying we're not going to do anything with it right now, we're going to put it on the back burner, they're like, no, this has to do with independence. And it seems to me that the believers that are leading this protest, and people have numbered this, like, what is it, 2 million people? I mean, that's enormous.
Yeah, it is an enormous number. Yeah,
we're talking about like 1 out of every 3 or so people on the entire island protesting. And it's really become, there's been one of the things that's been reported is that Sing Hallelujah to the Lord has become the unofficial song of the movement. And so on its face, this is about an extradition law, but at root, it's about, do we ultimately belong to the state, or do we have the rights to kind of give our allegiance to something different and something higher? I think this is a very, very interesting worldview clash as much as it is about any particular law.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, John. And when I heard that story that the song Sing Hallelujah to the Lord has become something of an unofficial anthem for the movement, I got to tell you, I was just really encouraged by that and energized by that in some way that, I'm not a part of the protest. I don't live in Hong Kong. But just to see brothers and sisters over there standing for truth, standing for freedom in difficult circumstances, in a way kind of steeled my backbone, if I may say it that way. It made me ask the question of myself, what am I doing? Am I doing enough? It's easy for me to live in this country, and maybe even I should be doing more. So I've just been encouraged by that. And I'll also tell you real quickly, when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, about 6 or 7 months later, I was at the National Religious Broadcasters event, and I had lunch with a guy who was there. And he said that in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, I think it was 89, it might have been 87 now that I think about it, they were singing hymns, sitting on top of the wall, singing hymns. A Christian worldview has been on the front lines of every great movement towards liberty for the last 150 years at least, and I think this is just one more example of it.
You're listening to Breakpoint this week. Come to breakpoint.org, click on the link there on the homepage. It says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, and we'll link you to the Breakpoint commentary where we talked about this kind of religious underpinning that is leading to this enormous protest in Hong Kong. Again, John Stonestreet here with Warren Smith. We'll be right back. Breakpoint is a ministry of the Colson Center, and we are supported by listeners like you. If you find the daily content that comes through our Breakpoint commentaries and our podcast episodes helpful, and that helps you develop a Christian worldview and engage the culture around you, we need your help to keep Breakpoint coming to you. Just come to breakpoint.org, click on the link there at the top of the page that says Give. Again, that's breakpoint.org. Click the button that says Give and become a supporter of the Colson Center and the content of Breakpoint. Thank you. Well, back on Breakpoint this week, John Stonestreet here with Warren Smith. Warren, you were saying something that I want to come back to. Right before the break, you said that the Christian worldview has been kind of behind all the major movements towards freedom, in the last X number of years, or maybe in your lifetime or something like that. that caught my attention. Here's why. So even as we record this here, I am in Grand Rapids, Michigan, speaking this week at the Acton Institute's Acton University. It's a terrific gathering. It's a lot of fun. It's one of the most diverse gatherings on the planet. And to prepare, one of the talks that I give at this event is called Colson and Kuyper. The Acton Institute has kind of repopularized Abraham Kuyper's writings, the Dutch theologian. That's really kind of the patron theologian of the Colson Center. And 20 years ago, Chuck gave a talk here in Grand Rapids. And as I was preparing for that talk, I watched Chuck describe the impact of Kuyper for today. And I want to bring this up. You and I wrote a book called Restoring All Things. Part of that, it was this conversation that you and I wanted to have was how God is working around the world through his ordinary people to do really remarkable things. In that talk 20 years ago, Chuck Colson sounded like an optimist. I'm telling you, he basically said that all the big world systems, what you think of communism, you think of all the totalitarian ideologies of the 20th century, they all failed. And there was nothing left on the table. Now, of course, when he's given this talk, it's before 9/11, it's before the clash of Islam. There's a lot of things happening here, but a lot of things that hadn't happened. But I'm listening to Chuck talk about and quote, I think it was Pope John Paul, who he was quoting him as saying, which I think John Paul talked about this being the springtime of Christian evangelization and the potential for Christianity to spread around the world. And I was really struck because listening to Chuck and agreeing with him theologically and the theological underpinnings of God's sovereignty over all things, and then you get to that kind of optimism that, hey, Christianity is going to move into kind of a springtime of influence, and then you think about where our culture has been, in the last 10 years, and you think, well, maybe Chuck got this wrong. But as you just said, the international picture, that's easy to say about the United States, but the international picture is to a world that's kind of exhausted all the other kind of pseudo-theologies, all the other political activist options. Christianity is very, very appealing to a world that's already tried all the other options. And maybe that's why, at one level, we're seeing the growth of Christianity around the world, even if we're not seeing it as much as we'd want here. Does that make any sense?
Well, it certainly does to me, John. And, we sometimes talk about a Christian worldview as, or any worldview as the story of the world. In other words, a worldview is how you make sense out of the big questions. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? That sort of thing. And we often sometimes say that the Christian worldview is the truest story of the world. It's the story that makes the most sense about the world. And the reason I mention that about worldview and those sort of definitional, foundational ideas is just to agree with what you just said. I think other worldviews, other ideologies have been tried, and they have failed. They have played themselves out. And all around the world, we are now seeing people turn to the Christian worldview, the Christian understanding of the world, that truer story of the world to try to make sense of the world. Winston Churchill once said about the United States that you could always count on Americans to do the right thing after they have tried every other option. And I think in some ways we're seeing that happen around the world, that different ideologies, communist, socialist, Islam, all these other ideologies and worldviews have been tried, they have failed, and now we're seeing people return to a worldview that has stood the test of time, Christianity.
Well, I hope that's the case. It doesn't seem like we have a springtime of evangelism on the horizon in the United States anytime soon. In fact, my other talk here at the Acton Institute's Acton University was on the Manhattan Declaration 10 years later. That's our most recent book, Life, Marriage, and Religious Liberty: What Belongs to God, What Belongs to Caesar. And you look at what's happened in the 10 years since the Manhattan Declaration was published, and on all three of those areas, Caesar's grasp has only gotten longer, gotten more intense, and tightened up. And too many Christians are kind of going along with this new agenda. The idea that you can't render to Caesar what belongs to God is something that we look around and we're not completely sure everyone is going to buy into that kind of agenda and buy into that level of courage. Robbie George, one of the authors of the Manhattan Declaration, just this week had a remarkable Facebook post. In fact, I changed my whole talk and just read it, where he talked about the need to encourage one another. Encourage being to put courage in. That if we're going to have the courage that we need, then we're going to need each other to look at each other and say, don't fold here. And I think one of the things that helps us remember that is when we realize that what we see in the United States is one thing, what we see around the world, it should help us realize that God is moving. God is moving everywhere. And this is what we're seeing, I think, in Hong Kong. I mean, there's a lot more that we could talk about. What's it look like to be faithful right now? What's it going to look like to be able to kind of raise our children in this in an environment where it takes courage, not just clarity, to have the sort of convictions we need to hold? These are real questions that I think all of us are facing. Well, you're listening to Breakpoint this week. John Stonestreet here, along with Warren Smith. Don't forget that we're coming up to the end of our fiscal year. The end of June is the end of our fiscal year. And the only way we can do what we do in producing terrific Worldview content that helps kind of feed your diet of clarity and conviction each and every day through our Breakpoint commentaries, through these weekly conversations that Warren and I have through the topics of the week, through our short courses, and certainly our training programs like the Colson Fellows Program, Wilberforce Weekend, and others, as we rely on the help and the support of folks like you to make it possible. And during this month, somebody has graciously provided a matching a challenge grant, which means that every dollar that you give to the Colson Center during this time of year is effectively double. Come to breakpoint.org, and there on the top of the page, you'll see a link that says Give. That's breakpoint.org, and then click Give, and you can actually make a tax-deductible donation to make sure that Breakpoint and Breakpoint This Week and the other programs of the Colson Center keep coming each and every day. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
You can learn more about Breakpoint and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview when you visit breakpoint.org. That's breakpoint.org.
Welcome back to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here, along with Warren Smith. Warren, one of the commentaries that I did this week on Breakpoint got an interesting reaction, and just being this week up at Acton University made me think about it again, just because we're seeing kind of a group of individuals, from different branches of Christianity get clarification on some really important issues. One of the things that we saw this week was a statement issued by the Vatican on marriage, sexuality, but specifically gender, and applied it directly to education and to Catholic educational institutions. Now, here's why I think this is important. Not because really there's anything remarkably new in this document. It's not like groundbreaking teaching. If you follow Breakpoint, for example, and how we've tried to clarify the God-given and created intent behind male and female, or if you read any Ryan Anderson lately, there's going to be nothing really revolutionary in this document. But here's why. There's been this narrative, particularly under the Pope Francis, that the Catholic Church will eventually become accommodating of the new revision of sexuality and the new ideas about gender. But there's really been this thought, and what we saw this week was the Vatican basically clarify, no, this is where we stand. Now, that doesn't mean that the application of this is going to be consistent going forward. But one of the things that we've talked about before here on this program years ago is this kind of historical inevitability narrative that really is believable, because the quickest way to get a front page article at USA Today or CNN is to tell them that you're an evangelical who's changed their mind on same-sex marriage. I mean, we've seen thoroughly theologically incompetent voices get platform status mainly because they say God has changed his mind on this without any sort of theological arguments whatsoever. And so it feeds that inevitability narrative, like that we're on the wrong side of history, the church is going to cave on this. And but what we've actually seen, if you do the math, is Christian institution after Christian institution, including those that would by no means be called conservative in a lot of ways, certainly not politically conservative, double back down and clarify. This is what we think about sexuality. This is what we think about marriage. Not everybody has. I'm not saying there hasn't been any kind of high profile, crossing the bridge, but far more have stood where they should stand than we often remember. And this is kind of a mark that, at least coming out of the Vatican and specifically applying it to education, which is where all the trouble is in the Catholic world, is in educational institutions on these issues, they made really clear where they stand.
Well, they certainly did. And if I, for one, and John, I know you for two, welcome that clarity. It's wonderful, even though obviously neither you nor I are Catholic, and we have some, real issues with some Catholic dogma and doctrine. It's wonderful to have co-belligerents. It's great to have folks that agree with you on certain things that you can sort of be in the foxhole with. So I welcome that. And, another thing that I welcome is the Catholic Church's long tradition on ethics and morality. They have a very solid body of literature going back for centuries that sort of codify what the church has historically believed. And I believe that corpus, that body of literature, of which now this new statement is a part, is a real gift to the church. And I think it's a gift to the church in particular in this way. It tells us that, you can't long fight reality, that in the end, reality always wins. And it is best just to state as clearly and as plainly as you can what biological reality is, what physical reality is, and conform your thinking to it rather than try to conform reality to some idiosyncratic opinion or idea that will ultimately not stand the test of time.
Oh, yeah. I mean, this week at my session at Acton University, and I was talking about, the Manhattan Declaration 10 years later. I mean, what is the current state of life, marriage, religious liberty, culturally speaking? And you kind of look at the track record and you realize, well, especially on marriage and religious liberty, it's nowhere near as good as it was 10 years ago in many ways. So I got the question afterwards, and I always love the questions at Acton University, always a sharp group of people of faith and many people in scholarship around the world and so on. I got the question, well, what if we lose all three? What do we do if we find ourselves and so on? And I think these are real questions. We've talked about on Breakpoint this idea of the theology of getting fired. When do you take the shot, because it's where you have to stand. But I also wanted to help people understand, look, when it comes to life, marriage, and religious liberty, there was historical inevitability proclaimed over the life issue in 1973, in 1974, 1975, and in the 80s and in the 90s. And the idea was that, look, if you're pro-life, you're on the wrong side of history. The Supreme Court has settled the issue, and that all old people, want abortion restriction, and all young people want abortion freedom, and the old people are going to die, and all we're going to have left is the young people who want, abortion on demand, and so on and so on. And that's turned out to be exactly and precisely wrong. The Supreme Court hasn't settled the issue, and whatever the Supreme Court settled at the federal level is now completely up for grabs at the state level and beyond. And you know what? The younger generation hasn't trended as pro-abortion, even as their parents. They've trended more pro-life. Now, it doesn't mean that there's not a long way to go in the life movement, but it also means that predictions of historical inevitability are hubris. It's not an actual argument to say, well, you're just on the wrong side of history. That's an assertion. And I think we oftentimes kind of want to duck and cover because we hear this, this one person is featured as a quote unquote pastor or whatever. And we often get asked to respond to it. And a part of me wants to say, look, I know he's on CNN, but he's actually not made a single argument. He's not worth responding to. What has he said that has changed anything about a historical understanding of sex and marriage? But it's the attention, it's the noise, it's that sort of thing. And I think it puts Christians in a corner. And I hope that a document like this, again, even though it's not groundbreaking, even though you and I aren't Catholic, even though the magisterium, speaking on these things isn't a source of authority for us, at the same time, I hope it encourages us that, historical inevitability is a narrative, not necessarily reality. We need to keep that in mind before we kind of, give up on this or that or the other. Hey, before we go, we got just a few minutes left, Warren, though. I want you to tell the story. It's a fascinating story, and let's end on some really good news. You sent me this story under the title, Disaster Deacon Rides Again. I love this sort of stuff. And so encourage us here before we call it a show.
Yeah, John, you've already mentioned the book that you and I wrote together, Restoring All Things, and so I'm kind of on the lookout for these stories of just ordinary people doing really cool stuff, really great stuff, and I found one, this disaster deacon, a 87-year-old man, Kenneth Harrell. His church, Tulsa, Oklahoma's Crosstown Church of Christ, started taking in Katrina refugees back in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. And Kenneth Harrell has been in the disaster business ever since. Right now, what's happening, many of our listeners may know, there's been severe flooding in the Midwest. The Arkansas River runs right through Tulsa, and that river's been out of its banks. This is a small church. This is not a mega church, a 300-member congregation. It's been housing up to 100 people a night. And because Kenneth Harrell is a deacon, at least in this little church, one of the things that means is that he's got the keys. So he has to be there to open up, to unlock the doors. He has to be there to lock up after everybody goes. He's come to be known as the disaster deacon. This is a guy that nearly 90 years old, and yet motivated by his Christian faith in community with others in this small church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. They're making a huge difference for the kingdom and in the lives of their neighbors. I mean, just one great way that we can love our neighbors as ourselves.
When I tell you what I love is we often, note that if Chuck Colson ever heard that you were going to retire, and go chase a white ball around some grass for the rest of your life, he'd light into you. And here you have a guy who's 87 years old, still getting up, serving the kingdom each and every day. Chuck would have loved this story as well. Hey, don't forget, we're coming up to the end of the fiscal year. We've got an incredible gift from a generous ministry partner of a challenge grant, so that every gift that you give to help keep Breakpoint and Breakpoint this week on the air and produced through our podcast, delivered through email, and all the other things that we do to help Christians think clearly from a Christian worldview. Any gift that you give during this month is going to be doubled. So please come to breakpoint.org and click on the button on the top that says Give and support us here at the end of the fiscal year. Well, you've been listening to Breakpoint this week. John Stonestreet here, along with Warren Smith. We'll be back again next week to talk about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview through this lens of this idea that ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.